Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We are tearing apart the ancient, terrifying concept of evil. I mean, is the devil a literal fallen angel pulling the strings of humanity? Or is God and Satan just, a psychological framework we invented to keep ourselves from acting like monsters?
Yeah, it really is this ultimate collision of the supernatural and the scientific.
It really is. And today we are putting religious theology and atheistic science head to head. We'll journey from ancient blood-soaked fire pits in Jerusalem and the Vatican's modern exorcisms straight into the sterile MRI machines scanning the brains of remorseless psychopaths. We'll even look at an invisible princess who stops kids from cheating.
Which is such a wild experiment, by the way.
Oh, it's fascinating. So here is the mission for you today. We are analyzing a stack of historical, neuroscientific, and theological sources to uncover where evil actually comes from. We want to see how humanity tries to control it and what that tells you about your own moral compass.
Right, we're diving deep into both the atheistic and the religious explanations for, well, the absolute darkest parts of human nature.
Exactly. And before we get into the really heavy stuff, if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button. Okay, so let's unpack this. To understand this massive debate between a divine creator and a secular, purely biological universe, we really have to look at how we first defined the ultimate bad guy.
Yeah, where does the concept of a literal supernatural evil actually start?
Right, because we weren't just born with this idea of a guy with horns and a pitchfork.
No, not at all. To trace the origin of that idea, we have to go back thousands of years to a very specific physical location. It's the Valley of Hinnom.
And it's just outside the ancient walls of Jerusalem, right?
Exactly. And in biblical times, this valley was the site of profound, almost unimaginable horror. According to the historical texts we have, some members of the Israelite community experienced these periods of intense agricultural panic.
Like a total survival fear.
Yeah. They were terrified that their crops wouldn't grow or the seasonal rains just wouldn't arrive, and that obviously meant the whole community would starve. So, driven by that absolute desperation, they created massive pits of fire.
Oh, wow.
And in those fire pits, they would actually sacrifice their firstborn sons to appease whatever forces they thought controlled the weather.
That is just a staggering level of desperation.
Yeah.
I mean, to sacrifice your own child for the survival of the crop.
It really represents the absolute darkest capability of human nature. And in the book of Jeremiah, we see a massive theological pushback against this. God explicitly condemns the practice.
Right, he speaks to the prophet saying he never commanded this.
Exactly, expressing profound anger. But what happens next is this fascinating linguistic and theological shift. The Valley of Hinnom becomes completely synonymous with ultimate wickedness.
Oh, because the Hebrew word for hell, Gehenna.
Yes. Gehenna is a direct derivation of the Valley of Hinnom. So out of this extreme trauma, you start to see the development of a distinct, separate entity that is solely responsible for all the bad things. It's essentially a scapegoat.
Precisely. A being that eventually comes to be known as Satan.
So humanity does something so horrific to itself, we almost require a separate supernatural entity to blame it on. We just couldn't bear to look in the mirror, so we created a monster.
That's a great way to put it.
And looking through our sources, this isn't just an isolated Judeo-Christian concept either. This psychological projection spans the entire globe. I mean, in Islam, you have the figure of Iblis.
Right, and in Buddhism, there's Mara.
Yeah, Mara, this demonic king who often takes on these terrifying half-human, half-animal forms to tempt people away from enlightenment. And then by the 8th and 9th centuries in Western Europe, Catholicism is literally painting the devil all over its churches.
Just these monstrous winged horned beasts emerging from the flames.
Right. Religion effectively gave human cruelty a face.
It gave it a face, a name, and a supernatural origin story. It established this core idea that evil is an external force acting upon us. But I want to pivot here, because modern science, specifically a secular atheistic view of the universe, strips the horns and the pitchfork away completely.
It really does.
In the scientific model, we don't need a fiery pit or a fallen angel to explain malice. We basically just need a brain scanner. Our sources highlight the research of neuroscientist Dr. Kent Keel.
His work is incredible.
Yeah, he has scanned the brains of over 800 psychopathic criminals. And he sat down with one particular inmate who was serving a life sentence. This man is a serial rapist and a murderer.
And a really extreme case, too.
Totally. And when asked why he committed these atrocities, the guy didn't say, the devil made me do it. He just said he had an impulse. He saw an opportunity, he took it. Zero remorse.
Just cold calculation.
Yeah.
And when Dr. Keel put this man in an MRI machine, The results fundamentally challenge the supernatural explanation for evil.
Because the MRI isn't looking for a corrupted soul.
Right. It looks at gray matter density and neural pathways. Dr. Keel specifically focused on the orbital frontal cortex, or the OFC.
Okay, break that down for us. What does the OFC actually do?
So, to understand the mechanics of this, you have to look at how the brain manages emotion. Deep in the brain, you have the amygdala, which generates our primal emotional responses.
Like fear and aggression.
Exactly, the raw impulses. But the orbital frontal cortex, which sits right behind your eyes, its job is to process social rules, empathy, and most importantly, to regulate those primal impulses through the amygdala.
So the orbital frontal cortex isn't just an empathy center. It's basically the brain's handbrake.
That is a perfect way to visualize it.
And this killer is driving a sports car with the brake lines completely severed.
Yes. In this particular killer, who Dr. Keel described as a 1 in a million extreme case, the MRI revealed that his OFC was massively reduced in volume.
Wow. Like physically smaller.
Physically atrophied compared to a healthy brain. The biological mechanism required to feel remorse or to just stop an aggressive impulse simply wasn't fully constructed.
That is wild.
And the killer himself actually looked at the scans and admitted, I think that I'm not wired the same as everybody else.
I want to challenge the secular view for a second, though. Let me throw this back to you. If the atheistic, purely scientific view is correct, and evil is just an underdeveloped orbital frontal cortex,
Yeah.
can we even call it evil? Or is it just a tragic biological malfunction, like having a broken leg, but in the impulse control center of the brain?
That is exactly the core dilemma of modern neuroscience when it intersects with law and morality.
Because it changed the blame.
Completely. If you operate within a religious or theological framework, evil is an active choice. It's a surrender to supernatural temptation, which means the person is entirely culpable.
Right.
But if we lean strictly into the biology, it becomes a question of mechanical capacity. That killer in the MRI machine actually admitted that if he were released, society wouldn't be safe.
Because he can't stop himself.
Right, because he literally lacks the physical brain structures that keep you or me from acting on violent impulses. So the question becomes, are we punishing people for having a soul corrupted by sin? Or are we locking them away because their biology makes them a dangerous, defective machine?
But that raises a massive contradiction. If evil is just biology, if it really is just a matter of a small OFC, why did human societies universally invent the watchful eyes of God and the punishing fires of the devil?
That's the evolutionary question, isn't it?
Yeah, why do we need the theology if the biology is what's really driving the car?
Well, because our brains are wired for self-preservation, and early societies desperately needed a way to enforce cooperation.
They didn't have a police force.
Exactly. The earliest way they did this wasn't with police, it was with the threat of cosmic surveillance. Let's travel to ancient Egypt for a second, specifically the tomb of Mena, which dates back to 1370 BC, over 3,500 years ago.
Okay, what happens in the tomb? What's on the walls?
The walls of the tomb depict a very specific mechanism for the afterlife. Mena's heart is physically placed on a scale. It's weighed against a feather representing the goddess of truth, Ma'at.
While the god Osiris watches the scales.
Right. And the profound psychological belief here was that every time you lied, cheated, or acted selfishly in your earthly life, your heart became physically heavier.
Oh, wow.
And a heavy heart meant you were devoured by a monster and denied entry into heaven. It's really one of the earliest recorded mechanisms of moral judgment tied directly to an afterlife.
It's the ultimate cosmic credit score. You are being audited by the universe.
And that fear of cosmic judgment wasn't isolated to Egypt. If you move over to ancient Iran around that same era, Zoroastrianism emerges.
Right, which is huge for this topic.
It is. This faith introduced the concept of a cataclysmic, ongoing battle between two mentalities, one fundamentally good, one fundamentally bad.
A literal war between God and the devil.
Exactly. And when the ancient Israelites were later exiled in Babylon, they encountered these Zoroastrian concepts, which heavily influenced the later Judeo-Christian frameworks of Satan as an active adversary.
Though it is worth noting that modern Zoroastrians have actually shifted away from that literal interpretation.
Yeah.
Today, many view the devil not as a supernatural monster, but as an internal mental struggle.
Which is a huge shift.
Yeah, they emphasize that because human problems are man-made, they require man-made solutions. Blaming a demon is basically seen as a way of avoiding personal accountability.
And that psychological pivot from a literal demon to a mental construct brings us right to the doorstep of modern behavioral science.
Which brings up the research of Dr. Jesse Bering, and this practically puts the invention of God under a microscope. So Dr. Bering ran this psychological experiment with young children.
The dart game.
Right, the dart game. He brings kids into a room to play this game where the prize is something they really, really want. He tells them the rules, the main one being, do not cross this line on the floor. And then he leaves them completely alone in the room. Hidden cameras are rolling, and of course the kids cheat. Almost immediately.
Naturally.
They step over the line, they walk right up to the board because they think no one is watching them.
It's just a raw display of human nature when the threat of consequence is removed.
But then he runs the exact same experiment with a new group of kids. This time, before he leaves the room, he introduces them to an empty chair in the corner.
Just a totally empty chair.
Yeah. He tells them that sitting in that chair is Princess Alice, a friendly, invisible, magical entity who's going to watch them play. Then he leaves, and the cheating absolutely plummets.
It's amazing.
The kids stay behind the line. One little girl even walks over, waves her hand over the empty chair, and whispers, Princess Alice, just to check if she's really there.
They really internalize it.
Think about how you drive when you see a police car in your rearview mirror versus when you're on an empty highway at 2 in the morning. Princess Alice is just a supernatural rearview mirror.
She serves the exact same psychological function as an all-knowing deity. I mean, she cares about social behavior, she is omnipresent in the room, and the implication is that she will somehow intervene or judge if the rules are broken.
So if the Princess Alice trick works so perfectly on toddlers, are you suggesting that early human societies essentially did the same thing to themselves? Did we invent God and the devil just to stop people from robbing the proverbial bank when nobody was looking?
That is the core mechanism of the atheistic psychological argument.
Wow.
If you are an early human tribe trying to survive, the threat of a heavy heart in Egypt or the fires of Gehenna is an incredible evolutionary tool for social cohesion. The fear of eternal damnation keeps the tribal group safe from itself.
So from a secular standpoint, we had to invent God because we couldn't afford for our neighbors to act on their darkest unchecked impulses.
Basically.
But we have to acknowledge that for billions of people on this planet, this is not just an evolutionary coping mechanism or a bedtime story. The presence of the divine and the reality of demonic forces is completely literal.
Absolutely literal.
And they point to physical manifestations of evil that science really struggles to explain away cleanly. Let's talk about exorcisms. Back in 2015, Pope Francis was filmed in St. Peter's Square laying his hands on a man in a wheelchair.
Right, reciting a fervent prayer.
Yeah, in an act that many onlookers and experts concluded was a modern exorcism.
And the Catholic Church maintains a very structured, ancient protocol for this. Exorcism isn't viewed as a psychological therapy session.
Not at all.
It is considered a literal prayer to cast out sentient demons using the authority of the Church, employing holy water, crucifixes, and relics. And the priests operating on the front lines report phenomena that they claim shatter the known laws of physics.
Give me an example of that.
Well, they document instances of a 110-pound young woman suddenly possessing the strength to throw 3 grown men across a room. There are reports from multiple independent teams of victims levitating off their beds.
Levitating. I mean, that's where the scientific community usually draws a hard line. How does the Church even begin to investigate or justify claims that completely violate the laws of physics?
The theological argument is that they aren't denying gravity exists. They are asserting that dark spiritual forces, because they operate outside the natural world, have the power to temporarily suspend those natural laws.
It's a terrifying concept, this idea of going to war with an invisible enemy. But not every culture approaches the supernatural with a battle mindset.
That's true.
In Varanasi, India, the Hindu rituals offer a completely different mechanism for dealing with the manifestation of evil. In their belief system, when someone's death is sudden or traumatic, it's believed their soul becomes trapped and angry.
Like a restless spirit.
Yeah, they become a sort of goblin or restless spirit that haunts their living relatives. It causes physical illness or sudden financial ruin.
But the intervention here is fascinating because there is no strict dichotomy between absolute good and absolute evil. Instead of a priest casting the demon back into hell, a shaman enters a trance, speaks in tongues, and actually communicates with the goblin.
They talk to it.
Yes. The spirit is treated with respect, almost like a grieving relative. The family will prepare it a special meal of honey, clarified butter, and fruit. They guide the spirit to take a dip in a sacred pond to purify it.
So the ultimate goal is to liberate the evil, to help it find peace, rather than simply destroying it.
Exactly.
If you treat the evil with empathy, it finds peace. That is a radically different psychological approach. But what happens when an entire community externalizes its fear? It's not just individuals who manifest monsters. Sometimes whole towns do.
Oh, mass hysteria.
Yeah. Our sources point to the legend of the Jersey Devil. The story goes that in 1735, in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, a woman named Mother Leeds cursed her 13th pregnancy.
And the legend says the child transformed, right?
Upon birth, the child transformed into a horse-faced, bat-winged dragon and flew up the chimney.
Which sounds exactly like a campfire fairy tale.
It really does. But fast forward to 1909, and this creature caused a literal, documented mass panic. Schools shut down across the region, businesses boarded up their windows, armed posses patrolled the woods.
Over a fairy tale.
The Philadelphia Zoo even offered a $10,000 reward for its capture. Even highly respected historical figures, like Naval Commodore Stephen Decatur, previously claimed to have seen it and actually fired a cannonball at it.
That is wild. But, we see a similar, though less panicked projection of awe with Devil's Tower in Wyoming.
Oh yeah, the giant rock formation.
Right. It's this colossal 900-foot shaft of volcanic rock rising abruptly out of the flat plains. It is so geologically unnatural that Native American tribes revere it as a sacred altar for communicating with the spirits.
It looks completely alien.
It does, and modern culture couldn't resist projecting onto it either. Hollywood used it as the landing site for alien UFOs in Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
So put this all together for us. Whether it's a Catholic priest battling a demon that throws men across a room, an Indian shaman feeding honey to a ghost, or an entire American town shutting down because they think a winged monster is in the woods.
Yeah.
What is the underlying mechanism here?
The mechanism is the human mind's desperate need to give a physical, tangible shape to our formless internal anxieties.
That makes a lot of sense.
Think about the exorcisms. Many veteran priests will admit that what they are often doing is healing deep, unaddressed psychological wounds, severe trauma, abuse, or deep-seated unforgiveness.
And when they fix that?
When that inner emotional wound is finally addressed, the demon miraculously loses its grip. Similarly, when a community undergoes mass hysteria like the 1909 Jersey Devil panic, they are collectively projecting their ambient societal fears onto a monstrous scapegoat.
Because it's easier to fight a monster in the woods than an abstract fear.
Precisely. Whether the monster is a literal beast in the woods or an unresolved trauma in the psyche, giving it a name and a shape gives us a mechanism to fight it. It gives us an illusion of control over the chaos of life.
So if we look at the guy in the MRI machine with the broken brain, and we look at the psychological trauma driving these exorcisms, we're left with a really uncomfortable question.
What's that?
If this is all just biological wiring and psychological projection, is there any actual hope of fixing it? Can evil be cured?
Well, if we look at the theological doctrine of original sin, the idea is that humanity inherently bends toward violence and selfishness because of the fall of Adam and Eve. The flaw is inherited.
The baked in.
Right. But the scientific atheistic model offers a totally different kind of intervention. Let's return to Dr. Kent Keel and his neuroscans.
Right, the researcher scanning the psychopaths.
He isn't just scanning adult lifers anymore. He has shifted his focus to scanning the brains of children, specifically high-risk kids in the juvenile justice system who have already committed severe offenses.
Try to catch it early.
Exactly. And this is where we have to introduce the concept of neuroplasticity. The brain's incredible ability to physically forge new neural pathways and rewire itself based on experiences.
So what did he find in the kids?
What the neuroscience shows is that by age 10 to 12, researchers can spot those exact same underdeveloped orbital frontal cortices.
Wow. At 10 years old.
Yeah. The hope is that by identifying this atrophy early, before the brain is fully set, scientists can use targeted behavioral therapies to essentially rebuild those neural pathways.
So utilizing neuroplasticity to stop a child from growing up to become a remorseless killer.
Exactly.
It's treating evil like a weakened muscle. It just needs intense physical therapy.
That's a great analogy.
But what about an adult who is already deep in the darkness? I want to share the story of a man named Brian. Brian was a neo-Nazi enforcer. For 16 years, he lived as a remorseless, borderline sociopathic agent of destruction.
Just completely consumed by it.
He said he had a hole in his soul, and his only desire was to inflict pain on the world. His face and neck were completely covered in violent hate tattoos.
A literal, physical manifestation of his internal state.
Exactly. But Brian's transformation didn't come from an early childhood intervention program or a medical procedure. It came when he met a woman and had a son.
Oh, wow.
Holding his child, he realized he could not bring a new life into that level of darkness. And during this transition, he reported feeling a tangible, godly presence in the universe that actively pulled him out of his hate.
That is intense.
And to physically represent his internal change, he endured 2.5 years of agonizing laser treatments to remove the tattoos from his face. 26 separate sessions that left him looking, in his own words, like the Elephant Man.
That sounds excruciating.
He viewed the physical pain as a necessary penance for the suffering he had caused others.
It is an incredibly profound story of redemption.
But here is where I want to push back on this strict neuroscience model. If evil is purely a biological destiny, a life sentence written into the gray matter of our orbital frontal cortex,
Yeah.
how does a man like Brian completely rewrite his moral code in his 30s? Is his redemption proof of a divine God reaching down to save him? Or is it just proof of the miraculous neuroplasticity of the human brain?
Well, what if it's both? What if they aren't mutually exclusive?
What do you mean?
The neuroscience tells us the brain can rewire itself, but it requires an intense environmental or emotional trigger to initiate that change. Brian's profound belief in a divine presence, coupled with the birth of his son, was the exact psychological trigger required to activate his brain's neuroplasticity.
So the belief itself was the medicine.
Yes, the theology might actually be the software required to rewrite the biological hardware. His story bridges the gap between the rigid doctrine of original sin and the cold determinism of a brain scan.
That is a fascinating way to look at it. Belief as the operating system for the brain. So as we wrap up this deep dive into our sources, let's look at what we've unpacked.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. We've weighed the supernatural reality of demons, divine judgment, and heavy Egyptian hearts against the cold, hard science of brain structures, MRI scans, and evolutionary psychology.
And Princess Alice.
And Princess Alice, of course. But ultimately, the existence of evil, however you choose to define it or measure it, seems to be the exact catalyst that forces humanity to develop our greatest traits. Without the darkness, we would never have been forced to invent unique concepts like kindness, mercy, and forgiveness.
The continuous struggle against our own darkest impulses is exactly what makes us human.
It really is. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. We talked about engineering our way out of bad brain wiring, using early intervention and therapy. But what if neuroscientists eventually invent a medical cure? Let's say a simple pill or an electrical implant that perfectly and instantly fixes the evil wiring in a psychopath's orbital frontal cortex.
Just a biological cure for evil.
Exactly. What does that mean for human free will? If morality becomes something we can just engineer in a lab, do we still need the concept of God or the devil to keep us in line? Or have we finally just outgrown the cosmic scales altogether and learned how to navigate the murky waters ourselves? Keep thinking deeper, and we'll catch you next time.